Okay, well this is my second video for making the Tiptap or Big Tap shoe pattern. So last time I talked about the materials that I was going to use, so what I'm going to show you today is how I cut out my pieces and where I put seam allowances and where I didn't put seam allowances, and also how I changed the pattern, the sole, to make it a little bit wider for my son's feet. So where did I put that piece? Well, anyway, I can't find the piece that was his foot shape. But what I did was I took the outline of his foot. And now, where is that? Oh. Okay, so this is the size I decided I was going to use. And what I did was I took the outline of his foot and then I just cut this one, a slit in it, and I widened it to fit his foot. Like this. You can see that fits much better. And then I just taped it up and I put it on here and I traced it. And then of course I evened this out some since it was supposed to be like that, and then made sure I had the middle marking and the sole marking here. And then I did the same thing on this vamp piece. So of course I had to change where this middle marking is so that it would actually be in the middle. So there's another way that she talks about widening it in the directions, and that way works just as well too, obviously, but this is just the way I did it, partially because I don't really measure stuff that well and I'm kind of lazy. It's pretty easy. If you want to narrow the piece, basically you just put the outline of your kid's foot on the pattern piece and you just basically slice the edges off and then retrace the pattern piece, if that makes sense, to match the pattern of the foot or the shape of the foot. So then as far as where the seam allowances are, you can see I use pretty small seam allowances here because I don't use the machine to put the sole on. I'm going to stitch it on by hand, and I know that I tend to use a small seam allowance. Let me see what this measurement is. So for me, this is like a little less than a 1/4 inch, which would be, let's see, if I can start at an actual number here, you know, like 5 millimeters or something. So that is what I use. If you are going to be using a machine, you might want to add a little bit more than that, like maybe closer to 3/8 inch, because sometimes it's a little trickier to get that narrow seam allowance with the machine. And then you have to just, since this pattern doesn't include seam allowances, which a lot of European and German patterns don't, you have to add them on yourself. And so I've added on what I'm going to use for seam allowance, but just try and figure out what you might need and add that. But of course you don't need to add that everywhere. So these pieces are going to have the seam allowance on both sides, and also this piece will have the seam allowance on both sides because you can see how I drew it here. I used chalk because of course this piece is going to be attached here around, and I made sure I marked my middle here too so we would know where that is. But some of these other pieces don't need a seam allowance on every side. So this one will have one on the bottom, of course, and around here and up here. But if you're going to be stitching it up the back, like hand stitching it with leather or something, and your leather's kind of thick and you don't want to have a thick seam, you can just put the neat edges together and stitch it. You don't need to add a seam allowance. So that's what I've done with my leather here. I didn't add a seam allowance. Let's see, find one that actually has the markings on it. Okay, right here. So I have a seam allowance here, and I'm going to be stitching this on the. Go get her.
What?
I'm going to be stitching this on the machine, but then this here I'm going to be stitching by hand, so I did not add a seam allowance. However, on the lining, this is my lining, you can see I do have a seam allowance here because this I'm going to be sewing on the machine. So I'm going to be placing these right sides together and stitching them on the machine, and then turning them out and then stitching them to the sole. So what other pieces? Okay, so this is another piece that this entire piece does not need a seam allowance at all. You can see I've just traced it out just the way the pattern piece is right here. The only thing different I did with this is I added a little extra because I am going to make this taller than the pattern here. They're going to be a little bit of a high top shoe. So I did add some extra height on this piece to go on the back because this piece goes here on the back. So I hope that is helpful. I've got pretty much all of my pieces cut out now, and then what I'm going to talk about is tomorrow or the next day, whenever I get the next one ready, is some of the other alterations you can do to this pattern. Of course, you can put in eyelets, which is in the pattern, but another way that I've done it is to add straps that have Velcro, which I'm probably going to do on this one because my 5-year-old does not want to learn how to tie his shoes, and laces can be irritating. So I'm probably going to use straps and do Velcro, and I will show you how I'm going to do that in another video. And I hope that you guys are having fun working on your tip taps also. All right.